Hey there. Tonight, we are stepping into a world that no longer exists, at least not in stone and papyrus, but it lives on in a kind of golden quiet, the kind you can almost hear if you close your eyes and let the noise of the modern world fall away. We are going to walk the streets of one of the most remarkable cities the ancient world ever produced. We are going to slip through the gates of a place where thinking was considered the highest form of living, where scholars rose with the Mediterranean sun, unrolled their scrolls by morning light, and spent their days in the most peaceful and purposeful labor imaginable, the labor of understanding. No battles tonight, no drama, just the soft rustle of papyrus, the distant sound of the harbor, the low murmur of minds at gentle work. Welcome to ancient Alexandria. Welcome to its libraries. And before we begin, a quiet word from me. If the kind of slow, historical storytelling we do here helps you ease into sleep, I would genuinely love your support. We are working toward 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and every single one of you makes that feel possible. If you enjoy tonight's journey, please like this video, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is on your clock, and subscribe if this is the sort of thing that brings you peace at the end of the day. If you still have a little sleepy hype left in you, send it our way. It means more than you know. Now, dim the lights. Let the imagined warmth of an Egyptian evening settle around you, and let us begin. There is a story, perhaps true, perhaps half remembered and polished smooth by centuries of retelling, that when Alexander the Great first stood on the strip of Egyptian coastline where he intended to build his city, he could not find chalk to mark out its boundaries on the ground. So he used grain instead. He poured white barley flour across the sand in broad, sweeping lines, tracing the shape of the streets and the contours of the harbor, sketching in the earth itself what he imagined a great city could become. Before the lines were even dry, birds descended, thousands of them, drawn by the grain, sweeping in from the sea and the marshes of the Nile Delta, covering his carefully laid plans in a living cloud of wings. His advisors were troubled. Surely this was a bad omen. But Alexander looked at the birds and called it something else entirely. He called it a sign that this city would one day feed the world. Whether that story is perfectly accurate or not does not matter too much. What matters is the spirit of it. Alexandria, from its very first moment, was conceived as something generous, a city meant to gather things, to accumulate abundance, to draw in what was best and most nourishing from everywhere and offer it outward to anyone with the hunger to receive it. Alexander founded the city in 331 before the Common Era, on a narrow stretch of land between the Mediterranean Sea to the north and Lake Mareotis to the south. The location was not accidental. This strip of coast connected via the Nile to the entire vast body of Egypt and beyond. Ships from Greece, from the Phoenician coast, from the islands of the Aegean, from the Black Sea and the shores of Asia Minor could sail directly into its harbor. And from the south came the wealth of Egypt itself, grain, papyrus, linen, ivory, flowing down the river and through the canals that would eventually link the Nile to the Red Sea, opening trade routes that reached all the way to India. Alexander himself did not live to see his city grow into what he imagined. He died young in Babylon in 323 before the Common Era, and left behind an empire that his generals immediately began dividing among themselves. Egypt, along with its extraordinary city, fell to a man named Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions. And it was Ptolemy I, later called Soter, meaning the Saviour, who took this city Alexander had sketched in grain and began building it into something the world had never quite seen before. Ptolemy understood something that not all rulers grasp. Power built on military conquest alone is fragile. It depends on the constant performance of strength, the ceaseless application of force. But power built on prestige, on beauty, on the genuine belief that your city is the most important place in the world, that kind of power has a different quality. It lingers, it attracts. People come to you not because they have to, but because they want to. And so Ptolemy began building not just walls and harbours and temples, though he built those too, but something subtler and more durable. He began building the idea of Alexandria as the centre of human thought. He invited scholars. He sent out letters and emissaries and official invitations to the best minds of the Greek-speaking world and beyond. He offered them something extraordinary, a place to live free of charge, meals provided, a salary, modest but real, no taxes, no military service, no scrambling for patronage or students or bread, just time, vast, unhurried, generous time to think. This was the founding dream, not a city that merely housed knowledge like a warehouse stores goods, but a city where knowledge was actively made, where the greatest minds of the age could gather in one place, share one garden, eat at one table, and through the friction and warmth of constant proximity, produce something the world had not yet imagined. That dream would become the Mouseion, and at the heart of the Mouseion, growing larger with every passing decade, breathing like a living thing, was the great Library of Alexandria. But before we step through its doors, let us first walk its streets. Let us arrive in Alexandria the way a scholar arriving from Athens or Cyrene or Rhodes would have arrived, by sea, sailing in through the harbour, watching the city rise slowly from the water as the ship drew near. Because the city itself, before you ever reached the library, was already a kind of education. It was already doing something to you, simply by being what it was. The light, first of all. Egyptian light is not like the light of Greece or Macedonia. It does not filter or soften. It falls straight down in the middle of the day, clean and white and absolute, making shadows sharp as knife edges and stone surfaces glow like heated metal. But in the mornings, when a scholar might rise early and take a first walk through the colonnaded streets, that light arrives obliquely from the east, slow and golden, catching the tops of columns and turning the city into something almost gentle. And in those early morning hours, when the harbour was quiet and the great broad streets were still half empty, Alexandria must have felt like a dream that had solidified just enough to walk through. Let us walk through it now. The city Alexander planned and Ptolemy built was laid out on a grid. This was a very deliberate choice. Greek city planning in the Hellenistic era favored order, symmetry, and rational design, and Alexandria was perhaps the most perfectly realized expression of that ideal the ancient world ever produced. Its streets ran in two primary directions, one great thoroughfare running east to west called the Canopic Way, and another cutting north to south to meet it at the city's heart.
The Canopic Way was extraordinary by any measure. Ancient sources describe it as being somewhere between 46 and 100 feet wide, broad enough in some accounts for 8 lanes of horses to pass abreast. It was lined on both sides by colonnades, long covered walkways formed by rows of closely spaced columns supporting a roof, so that even in the fierce heat of an Egyptian summer afternoon you could walk the length of the city in shade. The columns were of marble, pale and almost luminous. The pavement beneath was granite, carefully fitted, smooth underfoot, warm from the sun, but solid and reliable. On feast days and great occasions, this street would have been packed with people, noise, colour, and commerce. But on an ordinary morning in the early quiet of the Hellenistic world's most scholarly city, walking the Canopic Way was something closer to meditation. The city was divided into 5 districts, named after the first 5 letters of the Greek alphabet. The Greeks lived in their quarter, the Egyptians in theirs, and the Jewish community, substantial and intellectually active, speaking Greek but maintaining their own traditions and laws, in the Delta district, the 4th. This was not a city of one people. It was a deliberate experiment in what happened when different traditions were placed in close proximity with each other and encouraged not to erase one another, but to talk.
The harbour was the city's lungs. It breathed ships. The great harbour on the eastern side received the merchant vessels, the embassies, the scholars arriving from distant ports, the cargoes of papyrus and grain that flowed out, and the cargoes of books, ideas, cloth, spice, and curious travellers that flowed in. On the artificial breakwater dividing the great harbour from the western harbour, a structure called the Heptastadion, 7 stadia long, stretching out to the island of Pharos, you could stand and look in 2 directions at once and feel the enormity of what this city was doing, the sheer volume of connection it maintained with the rest of the world. And on Pharos Island itself, visible from almost anywhere in the harbour district on a clear day, and visible from the sea for many miles on any day at all, stood the lighthouse, the Pharos of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and by any reckoning one of the most practically impressive structures human hands had yet built. It stood, depending on whose account you trust, somewhere between 330 and 450 feet tall, taller than most modern buildings, taller than anything the Greek world had previously attempted at that scale. It had 3 tiers, a square base, an octagonal middle section, and a cylindrical top from which a great fire burned at night, its light reflected and magnified outward towards the sea by polished bronze mirrors. Sailors could see it from more than 30 miles away. Think about that for a moment, quietly. In a world before electricity, before the technology of industrial production, before anything we would recognize as modern engineering, a group of human beings built a tower that sent fire 30 miles into the night. They built it not for a god, not for a king's vanity, though it served both, but primarily for a practical purpose, to guide ships home safely. In the darkness, find the fire and follow it in. Even the lighthouse of Alexandria was an act of welcome. The royal quarter
occupied the northern part of the city, stretching along the waterfront where the sea breezes blew coolest. This was where the Ptolemaic palace complex spread across Cape Lochias, a long finger of land jutting into the eastern harbour. The palaces were enormous. Ancient sources suggest the royal quarter occupied somewhere between a quarter and a third of the entire city's area. Within this quarter, surrounded by gardens and colonnaded walkways, and the kind of monumental architecture that makes ordinary human beings feel not small exactly, but appropriately placed in the scale of things, sat the Mouseion, the Temple of the Muses, the world's first research university, the home of the great library.
To approach it from the Canopic Way, walking west to east through the morning colonnades, you would pass markets where booksellers already had their stalls set up, selling copies of popular works to literate Alexandrians who could afford them. You would pass temples to the Greek gods, to the Egyptian gods, whose forms and names blurred and merged in this syncretistic city into new hybrid presences, Serapis chief among them. You would pass bathhouses already steaming in the early hours. You would hear Greek spoken and Egyptian Demotic and Aramaic, and the older languages of traders from further east whose ships had come in on the morning tide. And eventually you would turn north, toward the harbour, toward the white stone walls of the most important intellectual complex the ancient world had yet assembled. The gate would have been open. The scholars inside were already at work. Section 3. The Dream of a Universal Library. How it came to be. Ideas rarely emerge fully formed from a single mind. They are more often the product of conversation, slow, accumulated, half-articulated at first, and then gradually sharpened into something recognizable. The idea of a universal library was like this. It had precursors. There had been libraries before. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal maintained a vast collection of clay tablets at Nineveh. The temples of Egypt held archives of sacred texts. Aristotle himself, Alexander's own tutor, had assembled at his Lyceum in Athens what was by the standards of the day a remarkable personal library, and that collection would later find its way by circuitous and disputed routes into the hands of the Ptolemies. But the specific vision that gave birth to Alexandria's library, the idea of a single place that would hold not just a great many books, but all books, every text ever written in any language by any hand, that was something new. The man most often credited with articulating this vision was Demetrius of Phalerum, an Athenian philosopher and former governor of Athens who arrived at the Ptolemaic court sometime around 297 before the Common Era. Demetrius had studied at the Lyceum under Theophrastus, who had succeeded Aristotle as its head, and he carried with him the deep Aristotelian conviction that knowledge was something to be systematically gathered, organized, and preserved. He became an advisor to Ptolemy I and reportedly proposed not just a library, but a specific kind of library, one devoted to the collection of every book written by every known author in every known language. The ambition was staggering. Not a library for one tradition, one people, one discipline, but a library for all of it. Philosophy and poetry and medicine and mathematics and history and geography and astronomy and drama and comedy, and the sacred texts of peoples whose names many Alexandrians could barely pronounce. All of it under one roof, in one city, tended by the finest minds the known world could supply. Ptolemy I embraced this vision with the enthusiasm of a man who understood exactly what it would do for his dynasty's reputation. This was not altruism purely,
Though there may have been genuine intellectual passion in the mix, it was also strategy of a remarkably elegant kind. If Alexandria became the place that every serious scholar in the known world wanted to be, then Alexandria would draw to itself a constant, self-renewing supply of the most brilliant human beings alive. And brilliant human beings, freed from the daily scramble of ordinary survival and given access to the accumulated knowledge of their predecessors, tend to produce new knowledge, discoveries, inventions, theories that turn out centuries later to have been correct. The practical work of building and filling the library fell to Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who reigned from 282 to 246 before the Common Era, and who proved to be exactly the kind of administrator a project of this scale required. Ptolemy II was not primarily a military man. He was a patron, a bureaucrat of genius, a man who understood that the real power of his dynasty lay in its cultural productions. He expanded the Mouseion complex, formalized the stipends and living arrangements for resident scholars, and began the aggressive acquisition of scrolls that would eventually bring the library's collection to its staggering height.
And the acquisition was, by the standards of any age, remarkably aggressive. Ships arriving in the harbour of Alexandria were subject to a peculiar practice. Officials would board them and search for books among the cargo. Any scrolls found were confiscated, not permanently, or at least not always, and taken to the library's scriptorium, where teams of trained copyists would reproduce them as quickly and accurately as possible. The originals were then retained for the library's shelves, and the copies, which the Alexandrians called the ship copies, were returned to their rightful owners. A subtlety of wording here is worth noting. What the owners received back was technically their property, their text, their words, their ideas, but in the form of a copy, while the original, the actual physical object that had accompanied the text from its place of origin, was now Ptolemaic property. Ptolemy III Euergetes took this acquisitiveness even further, at one point reportedly borrowing the official state copies of the great Athenian playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, which Athens held as precious civic treasures under the pretense of copying them. He paid a substantial deposit, copied them, and then cheerfully forfeited the deposit and kept the originals. He reportedly told the Athenians they could keep the money and the copies. The originals now belonged to Alexandria.
This is, depending on your perspective, either an act of magnificent cultural larceny or the most ambitious and consequential book collecting initiative in human history. Possibly both. What it produced across several generations of Ptolemaic patronage was a collection estimated by ancient sources at somewhere between 40,000 and 700,000 scrolls, a range so wide it reflects the genuine uncertainty of ancient record-keeping, rather than any exaggeration. Modern scholars generally settle on figures in the range of 400,000 to 500,000 individual scroll rolls, which, given that a single ancient scroll held roughly the equivalent of one chapter of a modern book, represents a collection whose total textual content would fill an entire large modern library several times over. It was, by every measure, the most important accumulation of human knowledge the world had yet assembled, and it lived in a building, or rather a complex of buildings, that was itself a remarkable thing to inhabit. Section 4. The Mouseion, more than a library. The word museum, which we use today to describe places where objects are preserved and displayed, comes from the Greek word Mouseion, meaning a sanctuary of the muses. But the ancient Mouseion was nothing like a modern museum. There were no display cases, no hushed galleries, no velvet ropes.
It was not a place for passive contemplation of things made in the past. It was a place of active, engaged, ongoing creation. More like a university, more like a research institute, more like a community of scholars living and working together in a space designed to make thinking as easy and as pleasant as possible.
The physical complex of the Mouseion and its attached library was substantial. Ancient sources, particularly the geographer Strabo, who visited around 20 before the Common Era and described what he saw with reasonable care, mention several distinct features. There was the exedra, a large covered hall or semicircular porch open on one side to the air and the gardens, fitted with seats, designed for public lectures and formal discussions. There was the oikos, the communal dining hall, where all resident scholars ate together, their meals provided by the royal treasury. There were private study rooms, small and quiet, where individual scholars could work in solitude. There were lecture halls for teaching. And there were the living quarters, modest but comfortable, arranged probably in something like a residential wing, where the scholars who had been accepted into the Mouseion community actually slept and kept their few personal possessions. The gardens deserve particular attention. They were not decorative only, though they were certainly beautiful. They were a working feature of the intellectual complex, modelled deliberately on the Lyceum of Athens, where Aristotle had famously taught while walking, so that his followers became known as the Peripatetics, those who walk about. The Mouseion had its own peripatos, a shaded colonnade designed specifically for walking and thinking and talking as you walked. Thinking, the ancient Greeks understood, with a wisdom that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to catch up with, is often done best in motion. Something about the rhythm of walking, the gentle coordination required to keep your feet moving steadily forward on familiar ground, frees the mind from the distraction of managing the body and allows ideas to surface with a naturalness that sitting still sometimes inhibits.
The botanical garden connected to the Mouseion was another working resource. The Ptolemies collected plants as deliberately as they collected books, importing specimens from across the known world, from the forests of Macedonia, from the coasts of the Levant, from the deep interior of Egypt, from the islands of the Aegean, from Persia and Babylon, and places whose names had only recently entered the Greek geographical imagination. These plants were studied by the scholars in residence, their properties catalogued, their uses in medicine documented. The great tradition of botanical medicine that stretches from the ancient world through the medieval period and into the pharmacopoeias of early modern Europe owes a significant debt to the systematic plant studies that were conducted in the gardens of the Mouseion. There was also, if the ancient sources are to be believed, something like an anatomical research space, a place where the physicians and medical philosophers, who were among the most celebrated of the Mouseion's residents, could conduct dissections, and in the early and most controversial period of the library's history, even vivisection of human subjects. This is one of the darker aspects of the institution, and it is worth naming honestly. The medical knowledge that was so productively generated at Alexandria came in part from practices that we would rightly find deeply troubling. The physicians Herophilus and Erasistratus, who worked at Alexandria in the early 3rd century before the Common Era, made extraordinary advances in the understanding of the human body. Herophilus accurately described the nervous system and distinguished arteries from veins, while Erasistratus came remarkably close to understanding the circulation of blood. And they did so through a level of direct anatomical investigation that went well beyond anything their predecessors had attempted.
But the heart of the Mouseion, the thing that connected all its other parts and gave them their purpose, was the great library itself.
The library proper was a series of adjacent rooms or halls arranged within the larger Mouseion complex, close enough to the royal palace to benefit from its protection, close enough to the harbour to receive the constant flow of new acquisitions brought in by ship. Its shelves, long wooden cases called pinaques, a word that originally meant simply flat boards or planks, stretched along the walls and perhaps into freestanding stacks, each case labelled, each scroll within it tagged with a small identification slip called a syllabus, giving the author's name and the work's title. This labelling system, elementary as it sounds, was a genuine intellectual innovation. Before it, even a scholar with access to a large collection might struggle to find what he was looking for within it. The Mouseion made finding things a science. And within these cool, dim rooms, the scrolls waited, hundreds of thousands of them, organized by subject and author and language, containing within their coiled papyrus lengths almost everything the ancient world had ever written down and managed to preserve. To stand in those rooms, in that stillness, surrounded by more knowledge than any single human being could absorb in a lifetime of reading, must have produced a feeling that had no quite adequate name, something between reverence and ambition. Something that made you want to sit down immediately and get to work.
Imagine waking in the residential wing of the Mouseion on an ordinary morning in the 3rd century before the Common Era. Not on a feast day, not on a day of special ceremony or royal visit, just a regular working morning in the greatest intellectual institution the world had yet produced. The light through the window, if your room faced east, would be the first thing. That specific quality of Eastern Mediterranean morning light, not harsh yet, still carrying some of the softness of the hour before sunrise, when the sky goes from black to a deep transparent blue, and then shifts gradually towards gold. The air at that hour is cooler than you might expect so close to Egypt. Alexandria sits on the coast, and the northern winds that ancient planners specifically angled the city's streets to catch flow in from the Mediterranean through most of the year, keeping the city measurably cooler than the Nile Valley to the south. On an early morning in spring or autumn, the air through an open window would be positively pleasant, carrying salt, carrying the faint smell of the harbour, carrying something green and damp from the direction of Lake Mareotis to the south.
Your room is not large. The scholars of the Mouseion did not live in luxury by the standards of the Ptolemaic court, but in comfort by almost any other standard of the ancient world. A wooden bed with a frame and a mattress stuffed with wool or rushes, a small table, perhaps a chest for personal belongings, a lamp on the table, oil still in the reservoir from the night before, the wick just beginning to be unnecessary as natural light asserts itself through the opening in the wall. On the table, or perhaps in a cloth bag hung from a hook, your current working scrolls, the texts you are engaged with at the moment, the work in progress, the notes you have been making on small tablets of wax that can be smoothed and reused when the thoughts they carry have been transferred to something more permanent. You dress simply. Scholars at the Mouseion wore what educated Greek-speaking men of the period wore, a tunic called a chiton, either of linen or wool depending on the season, and over it perhaps a hemation, a larger rectangular cloth that could be wrapped around the body in various configurations for warmth or formality. On your feet, sandals, though many scholars reportedly worked barefoot within the complex, especially in the gardens and the cooler interior rooms. Before anything else, before the day's intellectual work properly begins, there is the walk. This is perhaps the most characteristic feature of a scholar's morning at the Mouseion, and it is the feature that most clearly shows the peripatetic inheritance, the understanding, absorbed from Aristotelian tradition, that the mind works better when the body moves. You leave your room and walk into the garden as the sun climbs above the eastern wall of the complex, and for a time you simply move through the early morning, between the plants, along the colonnaded walkway, past the fountain if there is one, past the other scholars who are doing exactly the same thing, each lost in their own pre-breakfast thinking, each greeting one another with the nod or half-smile of people who share a space and a purpose, but also value their quiet. The sounds in this early hour are particular and lovely, in the quiet way that ordinary beautiful things are lovely when you allow yourself to actually notice them. Birds in the garden's trees. Alexandria was on a major migration route between Africa and Europe, and the variety of birds in and around the city would have been considerable, especially in the spring and autumn. The distant sounds of the city beginning its day outside the walls, the harbour always the first to animate, the sound of wooden hulls against stone quays, the voices of sailors and dockworkers speaking in a dozen languages. Closer by, within the Mouseion complex itself, the soft sound of someone already at their writing, the scratching of a reed pen on papyrus carrying faintly through the morning air. Breakfast, when it comes, is a modest affair. The ancient Greek diet was not elaborate. Bread, almost certainly, the flat, dense bread of the period, baked in the communal kitchen of the Mouseion complex. Olives, quite possibly, since olive cultivation was extensive in the Egyptian delta and the surrounding region. Dried figs or fresh ones, depending on the season. Cheese made from sheep's or goat's milk. Wine diluted heavily with water, since drinking undiluted wine in the morning was considered, even by the standards of a culture that drank wine at essentially every meal, somewhat excessive. Honey, perhaps, for sweetening. It is a simple breakfast, eaten quickly and without much ceremony, because what the scholars are hungry for is not really food. What they are hungry for is the morning's work. After breakfast, the day properly begins, and this is where the beautiful ordinariness of a scholar's life in Alexandria asserts itself, because the work, while profound in its implications and world-altering in its consequences, was done through the most patient and unhurried of methods. One scroll at a time, one line at a time, one problem held in the mind carefully, turned over slowly, looked at from different angles across the course of days or weeks or months, until something like clarity emerged. There was no deadline in the modern sense, no performance review, no quarterly target, no published output metric. There was simply the work and the time to do it, and the resources to support it. This, in all of human history, is not something that has happened very often or lasted very long. In Alexandria, during the great period of the Mouseion's flourishing, it happened for roughly a century and a half, and what it produced was extraordinary. A scholar arriving at the library rooms in the first proper hours of the morning would find them already inhabited by the particular quality of attention that reading produces. Other scholars already at their work, each positioned near the best available light. The tall windows facing the garden were most prized in the morning, when the sun came in from the east and fell across the reading surfaces at exactly the angle that made the papyrus text most legible without producing any glare. The light at this hour was still golden rather than white, and it gave the scroll surfaces a warmth that made them pleasant to look at, the dark ink of the letters standing out cleanly from the pale background of the papyrus. The choice of what to read on any given morning was a small daily act of intellectual autonomy that each scholar navigated differently. Some maintained a strict reading program, working systematically through a body of texts, all the historians, for example, in chronological order, or all the philosophers of one school before moving on to those of another. Others worked more responsively, pulled from one text to another by the trail of references and citations that every learned text contains, following an argument or an idea through multiple sources as curiosity dictated. Some read old familiar texts they had read many times before, finding in repeated reading a deepening rather than a diminishing of attention. The discovery, on the fourth or fifth encounter with a beloved passage, of something that was simply not visible on the first or second reading, something the author had embedded in the texture of their language at a level of subtlety that only sustained acquaintance could reveal.
The hush of the library rooms was real, but not absolute. There was the quiet sound of papyrus being unrolled, a dry whisper of material that had been in place for weeks or months, shifting back to life. There was the occasional soft sound of someone murmuring a text aloud, because ancient reading was not always entirely silent, and reading certain kinds of writing aloud, especially poetry or formal rhetoric, was considered not just acceptable, but actually helpful, since the auditory quality of the language was part of what the author intended and could not be properly assessed by the eye alone. There was the scratch of a reed pen when someone moved from reading to notation, capturing a thought or marking a passage for later reference on a small wax tablet kept ready to hand. And occasionally, breaking the quiet in the pleasant way that is only possible in a genuinely quiet place, there was the sound of a scholar finding something wonderful, a small exclamation, a breath held and released, the almost involuntary sound that a mind makes when it encounters something unexpected and true. When a passage in a text speaks so directly to a question that has been hovering unresolved for weeks, that the encounter feels less like reading and more like recognition. The strange excitement of finding that someone else, long ago, in a different language and a different century, thought their way to exactly the same place you are trying to reach, or to a place adjacent to it that illuminates yours in a way you could not have manufactured for yourself.
This is one of the deep gifts that large libraries give to those who use them seriously. The possibility of meeting across time minds that have grappled with the same questions. The sense that your thinking, however solitary it may feel in the present moment, is part of a conversation that began long before you arrived and will continue long after you are gone. A scholar in the Library of Alexandria, pulling a scroll from its case and beginning to read, was entering into this conversation with every mind that had ever contributed to the collection around him. Not passively, not as a receiver only, but as a participant, someone whose own reading and thinking and eventual writing would become part of the same ongoing exchange. Section 6. The Scrolls. What the Shelves Held.
To understand what working in the Library of Alexandria actually felt like, it helps to understand the physical nature of the scrolls themselves, because they are so different from any book you have ever held that the difference changes everything about how you imagine the experience of reading and working with them. A papyrus scroll was made from the pith of the papyrus plant, sliced into thin strips that were laid out in 2 perpendicular layers, moistened, pressed together, and dried into a sheet. This sheet was then cut or trimmed to size. Multiple sheets were joined end to end, and the resulting long strip was wound around a wooden or bone rod called an umbilicus. The finished scroll could then be unrolled from one end to the other for reading, or rewound, or partially opened to a specific passage if you knew roughly where in the scroll's length the passage occurred.
A typical scroll was somewhere between 20 and 30 feet long when fully unrolled, though some were considerably longer. It was held horizontally for reading, unrolling with one hand, while the other hand rolled up what had already been read on the other rod, so that you were always reading a segment of text framed on both sides by rolled papyrus, a window of words moving slowly from right to left across the opened portion. The writing itself was in Greek, the lingua franca of the Hellenistic scholarly world, rendered in dark ink with a reed pen cut to a fine point, the letters capitalized and run together without spaces between words, a convention that seems bewildering to modern eyes, but that ancient readers navigated through practice and familiarity, the way fluent readers of any language eventually stop processing individual letters and simply see meaning directly.
The scrolls in the library were organized using a system that Callimachus of Cyrene, one of the most remarkable intellects the Mouseion ever housed, developed and refined across his working lifetime there. Callimachus was primarily a poet. We have surviving fragments of his work, delicate and learned and formally innovative. But his most consequential contribution to human intellectual life was his development of the Pinnaces. The full title translates roughly as Tables of Persons Eminent in Every Branch of Learning, together with a list of their writings. It was, in essence, a catalogue of everything the library held, organized by author and subject, and it ran, according to ancient sources, to 120 volumes of its own. It was the world's first bibliography, the world's first library catalogue, and it is almost entirely lost, surviving only in fragments and references, which is one of the more poignant ironies of the library's legacy. What the shelves held was astonishing in its range. The Iliad and the Odyssey, of course. Homer was the foundational text of Greek literary and educational culture, the way the Bible would later be for medieval Europe, and multiple versions of both epics were held in the library, their textual variants carefully compared by the philologists whose work was one of the great scholarly achievements of the Alexandrian period. The complete works of Plato, or as complete as could be gathered, the dialogues of Aristotle, or those that had survived his school's sometimes tumultuous afterlife, the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the comedies of Aristophanes and Menander, the lyric poetry of Sappho and Pindar, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides.
But it was not only Greek. The library held Egyptian texts in both hieroglyphic and demotic script, including religious and astronomical traditions reaching back thousands of years before Alexander was born. It held Babylonian astronomical records and mathematical tables, Zoroastrian texts from Persia, early translations of what would become Indian philosophical and mathematical writings.
It held the sacred texts of the Jewish community, and at some point in the library's history, a moment of extraordinary cross-cultural significance, those texts would be translated from Hebrew into Greek within or near its walls. Each scroll in the library was tagged at one end with a small slip of parchment or papyrus called a syllabus, which is, you will notice, another word that has come down to us through the centuries, now meaning something like a course outline, but originally meaning simply a label, a small piece of text that told you what the larger object contained. The syllabus would give the author's name and the work's title, and perhaps which volume it was if the work occupied multiple scrolls. These tags dangled from the ends of the scrolls, where they rested in the wooden pinnaces cases, so that a scholar moving along the shelves could read the labels without pulling out each scroll, scanning for what he needed, the way a modern library user scans spines.
The organization was primarily by subject and then by author. The library seems to have been divided into broad sections: drama in one area, philosophy in another, history, mathematics, medicine, rhetoric. Within each section, authors were listed in what Callimachus's catalogue described as rough chronological order, the earliest first, which gave the shelves a temporal dimension as well. Reading along the philosophy section from end to end, you would move through something like a history of philosophical thought from its early origins through the work of Callimachus's own contemporaries. To spend a morning in those rooms, pulling scrolls from their cases and reading in the cool, papyrus-scented air, was to have access to the entire accumulated intellectual inheritance of the Mediterranean world and beyond. It was to stand at the convergence point of every tradition of systematic human thought that the ancient world had produced. No one scholar could read it all. No one human lifetime was long enough. But simply being in the presence of all of it, knowing that it was there, that any question you might have could probably be followed into the stacks and met with some kind of answer, that the thought any human mind had thought and recorded was in principle available to you, must have produced a kind of quiet exhilaration that is very difficult to describe and very easy to imagine. Section 7. The work of copying. Scribes and the scriptorium.
The library was not a static thing. It did not simply accumulate scrolls and then stop. It was a place of continuous production, new works being written, old works being copied, texts being compared and corrected and compiled into critical editions that would become the standard versions for centuries to come. And this work of reproduction and correction was carried out by a group of people whose contribution to Western civilization is almost entirely unsung: the scribes and copyists of the Alexandrian scriptorium. The scriptorium was the copying department, a room or perhaps a suite of rooms within the Mouseion complex where trained writers sat at their work surfaces and reproduced scrolls by hand. This was not a secondary or menial task in the intellectual culture of the library. It was central. The library's mission was explicitly to collect and preserve, and you cannot preserve a text that exists only in a single fragile copy. Every new acquisition needed to be copied, ideally more than once. Every text in the collection that was aging or deteriorating needed to be recopied before it was lost. And every text that a visiting scholar wanted to take away with them for their work, because the library also functioned, at least at certain periods, as something like a lending institution, needed to be copied so that the original stayed in the stacks.
The physical experience of copying a scroll was meditative in a very particular way. The scribe sat with the original text open before him, unrolled to the working passage, and reproduced it word by word onto a fresh sheet of papyrus. The writing instrument was a reed pen, a hollow reed stalk cut at an angle to produce a nib, dipped into an inkwell filled with a mixture of carbon black and gum arabic dissolved in water. The ink dried quickly, which was both a practical convenience and a constant small pressure. You could not linger too long between words, or the nib would begin to dry and produce imperfect strokes. The posture required for extended writing was particular. The scroll support angled slightly toward you, the writing arm moving in small, controlled gestures, the body largely still except for that one limb. Hours of this produced a specific kind of fatigue, not the broad physical exhaustion of manual labor, but a precise tiredness of the hand and wrist and eye, a sharpening of concentration that eventually became its own form of dulling. Experienced scribes developed the ability to enter something like a flow state while copying, in which the conscious mind barely engaged with the content of what the hand was writing, and instead simply served as a conduit, transmitting words from the original to the copy without the interference of interpretation. This sounds paradoxical. Surely you should understand what you are writing, but for the purposes of accurate reproduction, too much interpretation could actually be a problem. The scribe who understood the text too well was tempted to correct it, to smooth its irregularities, to make the author's meaning clearer by adjusting the author's words, which was sometimes exactly what was needed, and sometimes a source of significant error. Because textual accuracy was in the Alexandrian library not just a practical concern, but a philosophical one. The scholars who worked there, particularly those who specialized in philology, the study of texts and their correct forms, understood with unusual clarity that texts degrade as they are copied. Each generation of copying introduces new errors, and those errors are then themselves copied and recopied until what began as a small scribal slip becomes an established textual variant that later readers might mistake for the original. The work of recovering the authentic text of Homer or Sophocles or Plato, of stripping away the accumulated errors of centuries of transmission and finding something closer to what the author originally wrote, was one of the great scholarly projects of the Alexandrian period, and it was conducted with a rigor and sophistication that would not be matched again in the Western tradition until the Renaissance. Zenodotus of Ephesus, the library's first head librarian, was also one of its first and most important philologists. He produced critical editions of the Iliad and the Odyssey, comparing multiple existing copies of the texts, marking passages he considered doubtful or corrupt, proposing corrections, and arranging the poems in the division of 24 books each that has come down to us through the centuries as the standard form of both epics. You are reading Homer's Iliad in 24 books today, organized in a particular way, because Zenodotus of Ephesus sat in a room in Alexandria sometime in the early 3rd century before the Common Era and decided that was how they should be arranged. After Zenodotus came Aristophanes of Byzantium, who extended the philological work to the Greek lyric poets and comic playwrights, and then Aristarchus of Samothrace, who produced editions of Homer so authoritative that subsequent generations simply referred to them as Aristarchus, the way a later age might say the accepted text. These men, working through the long, quiet hours of their Alexandrian days, produced what amounts to the foundation of the entire Western tradition of textual scholarship. Every editor, every philologist, every person who has ever carefully compared different versions of a text and tried to determine which reading is more likely to be correct is, whether they know it or not, practicing a method that was developed in the scriptorium and the reading rooms of the Library of Alexandria. Section 8. The scholars who lived there. The names are, after more than 2,000 years, still remarkable. Not because they are merely historically significant, though they certainly are that, but because each name represents a human being who lived an actual life, who woke in the morning with an actual mind full of actual questions, who ate breakfast with actual colleagues, and walked in an actual garden, and sat down at an actual writing surface, and produced, through the ordinary patient labour of thinking and writing, results that have altered the course of human understanding. The scholars of the Mouseion were not legends, they were people, and their daily lives, in all their comfortable Alexandrian ordinariness, are part of the story.
Eratosthenes of Cyrene was the library's third head librarian, holding the position from around 246 to 195 before the Common Era, and he is perhaps the best illustration of what the Mouseion at its best could produce. Eratosthenes was not primarily a specialist. He worked in geography, mathematics, astronomy, poetry, literary criticism, and chronology, moving between disciplines with a fluency that his contemporaries sometimes mocked. They called him beta, meaning second, suggesting that he was second best in every field rather than first in any, but that we can now recognize as one of the most productive intellectual postures a human mind can adopt. He is the man who calculated the circumference of the earth. He did this famously using the observation that on the summer solstice sunlight fell directly into a well in the Egyptian city of Syene, modern-day Aswan, while in Alexandria, on the same day at the same time, a vertical post cast a shadow of measurable length. The angular difference between these two observations told him the curvature of the Earth's surface between the 2 points. Multiplying that angle out to a full circle, and measuring the distance between Alexandria and Syene, a distance known from the reports of professional surveyors who walked it in measured steps, gave him the Earth's circumference. His answer was approximately 25,000 miles. The correct answer, as we now know it, is approximately 24,901 miles. He was off by less than 1%. He did this without satellites, without GPS, without any technology more sophisticated than a stick, a shadow, and a piece of papyrus. He did it sitting in Alexandria, thinking carefully, applying elementary geometry to the right observations in the right way. And the library made it possible, because the library held the surveying records he needed, the geographical texts that confirmed the distance to Syene, the mathematical works of predecessors whose methods he built upon. Without the library, this calculation could not have been made. With it, a man in the 3rd century before the Common Era figured out the size of the planet he was standing on. Euclid is perhaps the most broadly famous of the Mouseion scholars, though his personal biography is almost entirely lost to us. We know he worked in Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy I, and that his Elements became the foundational text of geometric education for the next 2,000 years, but almost nothing of his daily life survives. What we can say is that the Elements, 13 books of systematic geometric proofs, building from simple axioms through increasingly complex theorems with a logical rigor that has not been surpassed, could only have been written in the context the Mouseion provided,
access to all previous Greek mathematical work, the leisure to organize and extend it systematically, and a community of colleagues capable of engaging with and critiquing the result.
There is a story about Euclid and Ptolemy I that is probably apocryphal but persistently charming. The king, reportedly struggling with the elements, asked Euclid whether there was not some shorter path to learning geometry. Euclid replied that there is no royal road to mathematics. The story may not be true, but it captures something real about the intellectual culture of the Mouseion, the idea that inside its walls, the hierarchy that governed everything else in the Ptolemaic world was, if not inverted, at least temporarily suspended. The king who fed you and housed you and paid your stipend could not make geometry easier. Some things simply required the same patient work from everyone, king and commoner alike. Aristarchus of Samos worked at the Mouseion in the early 3rd century before the Common Era, and proposed, in a work that survives only in fragmentary references, that the earth moves around the sun and not the other way around. He proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system approximately 1800 years before Copernicus. His reasoning was sound. The sun was clearly much larger than the earth, and it seemed more logical for the smaller body to orbit the larger than the reverse. His contemporaries mostly rejected the idea on philosophical grounds. It conflicted with the intuitive sense that the earth was fixed and everything moved around it. But the idea was thought, written down, and preserved in the library's stacks, where it waited for someone with the right moment and the right preparation to recognize its significance.
Callimachus of Cyrene, poet, scholar, librarian in a functional, if not official sense, author of the Pinaques, was among the most intellectually productive members of the Mouseion community across a long working life spent almost entirely in Alexandria. His poetry was technically brilliant, deliberately learned, written with an allusive density that assumed a reader as steeped in literary history as its author. One of his most famous pieces was the elegy for the death of his friend Heraclitus, which contains a line, "And you are ashes now, and ashes long ago," that has been called one of the most beautiful in Greek poetry. He lived surrounded by books and made his art from the same material he organized for others, the memory of what human beings had thought and felt and made. His daily life was, in one sense, the library. He worked in it, thought through it, lived shaped by its presence at every moment.
Apollonius of Rhodes, who was both a head librarian and the author of the Argonautica, a long epic poem recounting the voyage of Jason and the Argonauts in quest of the Golden Fleece, represents another aspect of Mouseion life, the scholar who is also a creative artist, using the library's resources not merely for scholarship, but for imaginative synthesis. The Argonautica draws on hundreds of earlier texts, weaving myths from different regions of the Greek world into a coherent narrative, demonstrating the kind of broad learned synthesis that only someone with access to and intimate familiarity with a very large library could produce. And the quarrel between Apollonius and his mentor Callimachus over the proper form of epic poetry, should it be long and traditional in the manner of Homer, or short and concentrated in the manner Callimachus preferred, is the first literary critical controversy in Western letters that we can trace in any detail. It was conducted between colleagues who shared meals in the same dining hall and walked in the same garden, and presumably, on some level, liked each other. Section 9. Communal meals and afternoon conversations.
There is something deeply humanizing about the communal meal. Whatever your intellectual stature, whatever the magnitude of your current project, whatever the grandeur of your ideas, when the bell rings for dinner, you put down your scroll and walk to the dining room and sit at a table with other people and eat. The Mouseion's oikos, its communal dining hall, was the social and conversational heart of the institution. Not the library itself, with its solitary reading and silent shelves. Not the exedra, with its formal lectures and structured debates. But the dining hall, where the food was plain and the wine was watered, and the conversation, freed from the structure of official intellectual production, could go anywhere. The meals were provided by the royal treasury, another mark of the extraordinary generosity of the Ptolemaic arrangement. Scholars who dined in the oikos did not pay. They were guests of the king in a permanent institutionalized sense, their daily bread a literal expression of the state's investment in their thinking. The Ptolemaic priest who oversaw the Mouseion complex as a whole, the head of the institution, a figure of considerable prestige, presided over the communal meals in some ceremonial capacity, connecting the act of eating together to the muses who gave the place its name, so that even a weekday dinner in the scholars' hall had a slight ritual quality, an acknowledgement that what these people did mattered beyond the merely personal. Picture the dining hall in the early afternoon. The Mediterranean sun is at its highest and most insistent outside, making the colonnaded walkways desirable and the open garden somewhat less comfortable. The scholars drift in from their various rooms and workspaces, scrolls tucked under arms or left behind at their reading surfaces, the morning's concentrated work giving way to the looser, more expansive mood that a midday break invites. They sit at long tables, 2 or 3 or 5 together, settling into the informal arrangements of familiarity and mutual interest that develop naturally in any residential community over time. The mathematician sits next to the geographer, as he usually does, because over the years they have developed a productive running argument about the relationship between abstract mathematical space and the actual measured distances of the Earth. The poet is at the far end, eating quickly because he wants to get back to a passage he was working on this morning that is almost right, and will, he is fairly sure, be exactly right if he can just find 40 more quiet minutes with it before it slips away. The philologist is deep in conversation with a newer arrival, a young scholar from Athens who has brought with him a text of Pindar that contains 2 lines the library's standard version does not have, and the question of whether those lines are genuine Pindar or a later interpolation is apparently one that cannot wait for a more formal setting. The conversations in the oikos ranged across everything. Ancient sources give us glimpses, though far fewer than we would like, of the kinds of intellectual exchanges that characterized Mouseion life. There were genuine disagreements about the correct text of a given poem, about the correct interpretation of a philosophical argument, about whether the earth moved around the sun or the sun around the earth, about the relative merits of long and short epic poetry, about the proper method for dissecting the human arm. These disagreements were conducted in the context of shared meals and shared space, and the particular kind of honesty that comes from knowing you will have to continue sitting next to this person at dinner for the foreseeable future. There is something important in that last point, something that distinguishes the intellectual culture of the Mouseion from the kind of exchange that happens in more formal or competitive settings. When you share a table with someone every day, when you pass the bread to them, and notice whether they seem tired or animated or preoccupied, you stop being able to treat them purely as an opponent in argument. They become a person first and a disputant second, and this changes the quality of the disagreement. It becomes, at its best, collaborative. Not two people trying to defeat each other, but two people trying together to find what is actually true, using the friction of their differing views as a honing tool rather than a weapon.
This did not mean there was no rivalry or bitterness in the Mouseion. The tension between Callimachus and Apollonius of Rhodes, the great debate over the proper form of epic poetry, apparently developed a personal edge that went beyond mere intellectual disagreement. Apollonius eventually left Alexandria for Rhodes, and whether this was a voluntary departure or something closer to exile under social pressure is not entirely clear. The scholars of the Mouseion were human, which means they were capable of petty competition and wounded pride. But even in this, the Mouseion produced something valuable. The debate between Callimachus and Apollonius was itself a contribution to literary theory. The question they were arguing about, what a long narrative poem should be, what obligations it had to tradition, and what freedoms it should claim, was real and important, and the fact that it was argued so publicly meant that subsequent poets across the Greek-speaking world had to take positions on it, think carefully about their own practice, and in doing so develop a more sophisticated understanding of what they were trying to do. Even the arguments of the Mouseion's dining hall ended up being educational. The food itself, on ordinary days, was modest but sufficient. Ancient Greek dietary culture placed little emphasis on elaborate cuisine. A meal in the Mouseion onkos was probably much like a meal in the refectory of any well-organized household. Good quality ingredients, simply prepared. Olives and oil from the delta's extensive groves. Fish from the Mediterranean, grilled or dried. Lentils and chickpeas, the reliable protein base of ancient Mediterranean cooking. Seasonal vegetables. Bread, always. Wine, always diluted, always present, but never the point of the meal.
On ordinary days, without royal visitors and without ceremony, the oikos was simply what it always was, a room where people who spent their days alone with books came together at the end of the morning's work and reminded themselves that they were not alone, that the questions they were pursuing were shared, that the larger project of understanding the world was a collective endeavor, that no single mind could encompass what all of them together were trying to know. The meal was brief, the conversation was not always brilliant, and sometimes what happened at lunch was that you sat in comfortable silence beside someone whose company you had come over years of shared meals and shared gardens to regard with a warmth that had nothing to do with intellectual productivity and everything to do with the simple human pleasure of familiar presence. The Hellenistic intellectual culture that the Mouseion embodied was, in this sense, genuinely dialectical, not just in the formal logical sense that Plato had made famous, the to and fro of argument through which truth was supposed to emerge, but in the social, relational sense of people who disagreed with each other while also genuinely valuing each other's company and finding that the disagreement, conducted in that spirit, was itself productive. The light afternoon meal became a kind of extended seminar in which nobody was trying to win exactly, and everybody was trying to understand.
After the midday meal, especially in the warmer months, there was often a period of rest. The afternoon siesta was a Mediterranean cultural practice long before the word siesta entered the Mediterranean languages, and even in the scholarly community of the Mouseion, the post-lunch hour of quiet was probably observed by most.
The heat, the cooling of exertion, the comfortable weight of a modest meal, these things conspire towards rest in any climate, and the ancient world did not resist them. Some scholars used this hour for the kind of half-waking contemplation that often produces surprising connections, lying on their beds with their eyes closed, and their minds turning slowly over whatever problem had been occupying them that morning, letting thoughts associate freely without the directed effort of active work. Others preferred to spend the early afternoon in the peripatos, the walking colonnade of the garden, where the shade and the air and the movement of the body combine to produce exactly the kind of half-focused, half-free mental state that good ideas favor. And this is where some of the most famous intellectual moments of the Alexandrian period may have occurred, not in formal lectures or structured debates, but in the quiet shaded walkway of the Mouseion garden, between two scholars walking slowly side by side in the Mediterranean afternoon, working through something together in the unhurried way that only people with sufficient time and sufficient trust can afford.
The garden of the Mouseion was not incidental to the institution. It was not simply a pleasant space between buildings, a concession to aesthetic sensibility in an otherwise purely functional complex. It was a working part of the intellectual infrastructure, as important in its own way as the scroll stacks, or the lecture halls, or the dining room. And to understand why requires understanding something that the ancient Greeks grasped intuitively, and that modern cognitive science is only recently beginning to quantify: the relationship between physical environment and the quality of thought. Aristotle's school in Athens, the Lyceum, had been built around a gymnasium, a garden, and a covered walkway. The choice was deliberate. Aristotle believed, and the tradition he established maintained, that philosophical inquiry was best conducted in motion, in green and living spaces, with access to natural light and moving air. The walking colonnade, the shaded path between living plants, the sound of water if there was a fountain, these things were understood as cognitive tools, as features of an environment designed to support a particular kind of mental activity. The Mouseion's garden reflected this understanding directly. It contained, according to the ancient sources, a variety of trees and plants collected from across the known world. There were trees from the northern shores of the Mediterranean, oaks perhaps, or pines, alongside the palms and acacias more native to the Egyptian climate. There were medicinal herbs, carefully cultivated and labelled, providing a living pharmacopoeia for the physicians and botanists among the scholars. There were probably roses, since the Hellenistic world had an intense appreciation for roses that expressed itself in cultivation, poetry, and the use of rosewater in everything from religious ceremony to medicine to cooking. The entire garden was enclosed by the Mouseion's walls and colonnades, creating a contained world of green and shade within the larger world of white stone and bright sky. In the early morning, the garden was cool and damp, the night's dew still on the broad leaves of the larger plants, the birds loudly working through the hedges and tree canopies. A scholar walking here in the first hour after dawn moved through light that was still young and mild, casting long, soft shadows from the columns of the peripatos, the stone of the walkway slightly cold underfoot if you had come out without your sandals. The smell of the garden at this hour was particular and excellent. Green things, water, stone, the distant salt of the harbour, and under it all that specific quality of Egyptian morning air that carries something ancient and unhurried in it, as though the air itself has absorbed 10,000 years of slow agricultural life along the Nile Delta.
By mid-morning, when the sun was well up and the day's heat beginning to assert itself, the garden's colonnaded walkway became its most valuable feature. The peripatos ran around the inner edge of the garden, its roof supported by columns spaced evenly at the distance a walking person naturally covers in a few comfortable strides, so that as you walked, you moved from column to column at a pace that imposed its own gentle rhythm on your thinking. The shade the colonnade provided was complete. In the Hellenistic Mediterranean, with its intense midday sun, complete shade was a luxury and a comfort of significant practical value. You could walk here at noon without the heat becoming oppressive, and this meant the garden remained usable through the hottest part of the day when the exposed streets of the city were nearly empty. The conversations that happened in the peripatos were different in quality from those that happened in the dining hall, or the lecture room, or the formal spaces of the exedra. The motion, the rhythm, the slight physical engagement of walking, these things loosened something in the way people talked. Arguments became more exploratory. Ideas that would have sounded too uncertain, too preliminary for the formality of a lecture room, could be floated tentatively while walking, tested in the air, modified or abandoned, without the awkwardness of having stated them too definitively. The peripatos was a place for thinking out loud in the company of a trusted colleague, and the culture of the Mouseion seems to have understood and honoured this. You did not interrupt a man walking alone in the peripatos unless you had something worth saying, and if you fell into step beside him, you were implicitly agreeing to the particular rules of that space. No judgment, no transcript, just two minds working together through the movement of two bodies in a shaded garden. The botanical studies conducted in the garden extended the Mouseion's intellectual reach in directions that might not immediately seem connected to a library, but the ancient scholars understood knowledge as unified. The same intellectual rigor that you brought to textual analysis, the careful observation, the systematic comparison, the effort to distinguish what was reliably known from what was merely asserted, could be applied to the study of plants, or stars, or the human body. The garden was a living library of a different kind, its specimens as carefully collected and as thoughtfully organized as the scrolls on the shelves inside.
Theophrastus, Aristotle's successor at the Lyceum, had written 2 books on plants, the Inquiry into Plants and the Causes of Plants, that were among the most important scientific works in the Mouseion's collection, and that shaped how the botanical scholars of Alexandria understood and approached their work. In the Mouseion's garden, that textual knowledge met living reality, and the combination produced advances in botanical understanding that would form the basis of pharmacological practice for the next 1,000 years.
To walk in this garden on an ordinary afternoon, among the plants and the column shadows, and the occasional murmuring voices of scholars deep in their peripatetic conversations, was to move through a space that had been designed, with great care and considerable wisdom, to make human thinking as easy and as fruitful as possible. It was quiet, as libraries are supposed to be quiet, but it was not the quiet of absence. It was the quiet of presence, of attention, of lives being thoughtfully lived in full knowledge of their purpose. Section 11. The Smaller Library of the Serapeum. Not everyone who wanted to use the intellectual resources of Alexandria had the credentials to enter the Mouseion itself. The institution was, after all, a research community supported by royal patronage, and membership in it was selective. The scholars who lived and worked there had been invited, recruited, vetted, accepted by a process whose details are not fully clear to us, but that clearly involved some form of scholarly achievement sufficient to impress the Ptolemaic court and its advisers. The ordinary educated Alexandrian citizen, the literate merchant or priest or physician who wanted access to books and learning but had no claim to a place in the Mouseion, needed somewhere else to go.
That somewhere else was the Serapeum. The Temple of Serapis was one of the most important religious structures in Alexandria, dedicated to the hybrid god Serapis, who was one of the Ptolemies' most successful cultural inventions, a deity who combined aspects of the Egyptian gods Osiris and Apis with elements of the Greek gods Zeus and Hades, creating a figure who could be worshipped by both the Egyptian population and the Greek ruling class as a shared divine presence. The temple was large, imposing, and centrally located, visible from much of the city and accessible to people from all of its districts. At some point in the library's history, probably during the reign of Ptolemy III, a substantial secondary library was established in the Serapeum complex, sometimes called the Daughter Library. It was smaller than the main library in the Mouseion, with estimates of its collection ranging around 200,000 to 300,000 scrolls, but it was nevertheless enormous by any standard other than the extraordinary scale of its parent institution. And crucially, it seems to have been more broadly accessible, open to a wider public than the exclusively scholarly community of the Mouseion.
The atmosphere of the Serapeum Library would have been different from the main library in interesting ways. Where the Mouseion was a quiet, residential, scholarly community, going about its work with the unhurried confidence of people who belong there, the Serapeum would have had more the quality of a public institution, people arriving from outside, some with specific scholarly purposes, and some simply with the general desire to read or hear something worthwhile. The city's educated general public passed through it, priests and administrators who needed to consult specific texts, physicians checking medical works, teachers of rhetoric or philosophy looking for texts to use in their classes, educated men and women of leisure who read for pleasure. In the broad porticos surrounding the temple, with their shade and their stone benches, a visitor to the Serapeum on an ordinary afternoon might find 3 or 4 people reading independently, each with a borrowed scroll open before them, each in their own private world of concentration. The sound in those porticos would have been very quiet, perhaps the faint sound of lips moving, since silent reading was less universal in the ancient world than it is today, and many literate people read aloud in a low murmur even when alone. The slap of sandals on stone as someone walked in from the bright street outside, blinking in the cooler shade. The distant sounds of the city, muffled by walls and distance.
the smell of incense from the temple precinct, drifting through the air with the particular sacred quality that ancient religious spaces carried.
There is something worth dwelling on in the image of those afternoon readers in the Serapeum portico. They came from different parts of the city, spoke different languages at home, prayed to different gods in their private lives. A Greek merchant's son bent over a scroll of Thucydides, preparing arguments he intended to use in a legal dispute. A Jewish scholar working through a Greek translation of a philosophical text, trying to understand how Greek ideas about the soul related to Hebrew ones. An Egyptian priest reading in demotic from a text that encoded centuries of his people's astronomical knowledge, comparing it quietly with a Greek astronomical work he held in his other hand. They did not necessarily speak to one another. They did not need to. The space did the work of bringing them together, placing them in the same quiet, under the same stone columns, in the same afternoon light, each pursuing their own understanding, each part of the same larger human project, without any formal acknowledgement of that fact. This was perhaps the most democratic aspect of the entire Alexandrian intellectual enterprise. The Mouseion was exclusive, residential, sustained by royal patronage, and accessible only to those who had been formally invited into its community. But the Serapeum Library was something that the city itself could use, a public good, imperfect and limited by the standards of what we might ideally wish, but real in the most practical sense, a place where the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world was available on an ordinary afternoon to anyone who could read and who had the time and the inclination to come and sit with it for a while.
The Serapeum Library was also, in at least some periods of Alexandria's history, a place of cross-cultural scholarly exchange, in a way that even the cosmopolitan Mouseion sometimes was not. The temple's syncretique deity made it a meeting point for Egyptian, Greek, and Jewish religious and intellectual traditions in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes extraordinarily productive. Jewish scholars working in Alexandria, including those who participated in the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, may have used the Serapeum's resources. Egyptian priests who maintained their own scholarly traditions in the hieroglyphic and demotic languages worked in proximity to Greek philosophers. The conversations that happened there, not in the formal setting of a lecture or a symposium, but in the casual adjacency of people who happened to be working in the same shaded portico on the same afternoon, were sometimes the most generative of all. This was the library that most Alexandrians actually experienced in their daily lives. Not the grand institution of the Mouseion, with its famous scholars and royal patronage and breathtaking collection, but this somewhat smaller, somewhat more accessible, somewhat more human-scaled place in the shadow of the Serapis Temple, where anyone who could read might come and spend an afternoon in the quiet company of books. Section 12. The Languages of Knowledge, Translation, and the Meeting of Worlds.
One of the most extraordinary projects undertaken in or around the Library of Alexandria was not the collection of existing books or the production of new ones, but the translation of one tradition into the language of another. Translation is, in many ways, the most intimate form of intellectual labor. It requires you to step entirely inside another mind, another tradition, another way of organizing reality, and then to step out again, carrying as much of what you found there as can be carried without breaking it. It requires humility,
the willingness to subordinate your own voice entirely to the service of another's. And it requires extraordinary facility with language, since the goal is not merely to convey information, but to convey the particular quality and weight and resonance of the original. The most famous translation project associated with Alexandria was the rendering of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the work known as the Septuagint, a word derived from the Latin for 70, referring to the tradition that 70 or 72 Jewish scholars accomplished the translation in 72 days. The story in that precise form is legend, but the underlying fact is historical. Sometime in the 3rd century before the Common Era, in Alexandria, a team of Jewish scholars who were fluent in both Hebrew and Greek produced what became the standard Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, a text that would shape the entire subsequent history of both Judaism and Christianity.
The Septuagint was needed because the large and flourishing Jewish community in Alexandria, one of the largest Jewish diaspora communities in the ancient world, was increasingly Greek-speaking. These were families who had been in Egypt for generations, who spoke Greek in their daily lives, who educated their children in Greek schools and conducted their commerce in Greek, and for whom the original Hebrew of the Scriptures was becoming a language known primarily in the scholarly and religious context of the synagogue, rather than in everyday life. A Greek text of their sacred writings was, for this community, a genuine spiritual and cultural necessity. The scholars who did this work sat, presumably, in rooms much like those of the Mouseion itself, with scrolls of the Hebrew text open before them and blank papyrus sheets ready for the Greek translation beside them. The challenge they faced was profound. Hebrew and Greek are very different languages, not just in their grammatical structures, but in their fundamental ways of organizing meaning. Hebrew tends toward the concrete, the narrative, the particular. It tells stories in specific physical detail. It names things. It describes actions. Greek philosophical language, by contrast, tends toward the abstract, the analytic, the general. It defines terms. It reasons from principle. It builds arguments. Translating from one to the other required not just linguistic skill, but philosophical intelligence, a willingness to make choices about which Greek concept best captured a Hebrew one, knowing that every such choice would carry implications that the original text did not contain.
The resulting translation was imperfect in the way all translations are imperfect, and scholars have been debating its choices ever since. But it was also a work of genuine genius, and it had consequences that its authors could not possibly have foreseen. The Septuagint became the version of the Jewish scriptures that the earliest Christians knew. Paul quotes it, the Gospel writers quote it, the entire New Testament is saturated with its language. The concept of logos that opens the Gospel of John, "In the beginning was the Word," comes from the Platonic and Stoic philosophical tradition that was the intellectual atmosphere of Alexandrian Greek, filtered into the translation tradition that the Septuagint helped establish. Without the translation project in Alexandria, the Bible that shaped Western civilization would have been a different book. But the translation work was not limited to Hebrew. The Mouseions, linguists and scribes, worked on Egyptian texts, on Babylonian astronomical and mathematical records, on Persian religious writings, and possibly on texts from even further east, whose precise nature and language history cannot now reconstruct.
The Egyptian priest Manetho, who worked in or around Alexandria in the early Ptolemaic period, produced in Greek a history of Egypt organized around the dynasties of its pharaohs, a work whose basic framework historians still use today when they refer to the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom. The Babylonian priest Berossus produced a Greek history of Mesopotamia. In each case, an ancient tradition that had been recorded and preserved in a language inaccessible to Greek-speaking scholars was brought across the linguistic boundary and made available to the broader intellectual community that the Mouseion represented.
This act of translation, repeated across decades and languages and traditions, conducted in the quiet rooms of the Mouseion complex and the colonnaded spaces of the Serapeum, was itself an act of humility remarkable for its era. The Ptolemaic cultural project was fundamentally Greek and aimed at advancing Greek language and culture as the universal medium of civilized discourse. And yet the scholars and translators who worked within it acknowledged, implicitly and through their labor, that knowledge was not the exclusive property of any single tradition, that the Egyptians and Babylonians and Hebrews had in their different ways and their different languages thought carefully about the world and preserved those thoughts in written form, and that those thoughts deserved to be brought into the great common conversation that the library was trying to create and sustain. Consider for a moment what a translator's working day in Alexandria actually looked like. The translator would have two texts open before them simultaneously, the original in its source language and the growing Greek version on a fresh piece of papyrus. Between the two, held in the translator's mind, was the entire complex problem of equivalence, not just the equivalence of individual words, which a bilingual glossary could handle, but the deeper equivalence of concepts, of syntactic patterns, of the particular emotional and philosophical weight that certain phrases carry in their original cultural context, and must somehow carry, transformed but not diminished, in their new linguistic home. The translator of the Septuagint, working with a Hebrew text whose cadences and imagery were formed over centuries of a specific religious and cultural tradition, and rendering it into Greek for readers who came to it without that tradition, faced choices on every line that were simultaneously linguistic, philosophical, and theological. When the Hebrew uses the word ruach, which means wind and breath and spirit, sometimes all at once, their interchangeability being itself a theological statement about the intimate connection between life and breath and divine presence, what Greek word do you choose? Pneuma carries some of the same range, but its philosophical associations in Greek are different, weighted by centuries of Platonic and Stoic thought that the Hebrew text could not have anticipated. Every such choice was both a translation decision and an interpretation, a small act of creative engagement with the text that left the translator's fingerprints permanently embedded in what readers would receive. The same kind of engagement was required when Babylonian astronomical tables were rendered from cuneiform into Greek. Babylonian astronomy was extraordinarily sophisticated. Centuries of systematic observation of the heavens, recorded with a precision and consistency that allowed Babylonian astronomers to predict the positions of the planets with remarkable accuracy. But the conceptual framework within which this observational data was organized was different from the Greek one. Babylonian astronomy was fundamentally computational and predictive, concerned with producing accurate tables rather than explanatory theories. Greek astronomy, by contrast,
was increasingly concerned with geometrical models, with explaining the observed motions of celestial bodies in terms of spheres and circles, building a picture of what the heavens actually looked like in three-dimensional space. Translating Babylonian astronomical data into Greek was not just a matter of language. It required a conceptual translation as well, the rendering of one intellectual tradition's way of organizing and understanding a phenomenon into the categories of another tradition. And the result, when it worked, was something richer than either original, a synthesis that drew on the observational power of one tradition and the theoretical ambition of the other.
This is what the library made possible, and what the translators quietly did. The bringing together of different ways of knowing into a space where they could inform and challenge and enrich each other. Not the erasure of difference, not the implication that all knowledge traditions were really saying the same thing and could simply be collapsed into a single Greek synthesis, but the genuine encounter of different traditions, different methods, different sets of questions and answers, in conditions that allowed each to be heard on its own terms and understood in relation to others. The library was a place of translation in this deeper sense, as well as the literal one. It was a place where the world's various intellectual traditions were translated into each other's presence. Section 13. Evening in the library. Lamps, lamplight, and the end of the day. The afternoon moves slowly towards evening in Alexandria. The light begins to change around the 5th hour afternoon, the harsh white intensity of midday softening, the shadows lengthening, the air losing a degree or two of its heat as the sea breeze strengthens slightly in the late afternoon. This change in light is felt first in the library rooms, which face the inner garden and so catch the angle of the later sun in a particular way, the light coming in lower now, striking the upper shelves first and then the middle ones, turning the pale wooden cases of the pinators a warm amber.
Scholars who have been working since morning begin to feel the specific quality of late afternoon tiredness, not the sharp fatigue of recent exertion, but a deep, comfortable weariness, the particular heaviness of a mind that has been used steadily for many hours, and is beginning, gently and without urgency, to insist on rest. The scroll they have been working with is nearly at the end of its useful reading section. The last few passages have been read more slowly, absorbed less deeply, the mind's grip on the material becoming less sure as the afternoon deepens. This is not a cause for frustration. This is simply the natural limit of a day's work, and the scholars of the Mouseion, living in a culture that had not yet invented the concept of artificial extension of the working day through artificial light or stimulant chemicals, understood and accepted it as such. The lamps are lit as the light in the reading rooms begins to fade. These are simple clay or bronze lamps, shallow dishes of olive oil with a wick of linen or papyrus floating in the oil, held above the surface at one end by a small notch in the rim. The flame they produce is small, nothing like the broad, flat illumination of a modern electric light, but warm and sufficient for close reading if the lamp is placed near the work. The smell of burning olive oil is mild and organic, something between cooking and incense, and it mixes with the papyrus smell that permeates the reading rooms like a kind of scholarly perfume. A room full of lighted oil lamps and open scrolls has a warmth to it that goes beyond temperature, a quality of gathered light and focused attention that is genuinely beautiful.
The lamp is a small object of quiet significance in the world of ancient scholarship. Wherever sustained intellectual work was done after sundown,
and it was done, though not as commonly or as exhaustingly as in the modern world's all-night culture. The lamp was its enabler, the small flame that extended the usable day by a few precious hours. Scholars who worked by lamplight did so deliberately, choosing to extend their engagement with a text beyond the natural limit of daylight, because the argument they were following was at a critical juncture, or because the morning had been interrupted by a lecture or a conversation, and the day's reading was not yet complete, or simply because the particular quality of lamplight, its intimacy, its concentration of illumination on exactly the small area directly before you while the rest of the room retreated into shadow, suited a certain kind of thinking that required depth rather than breadth, the slow examination of a few lines rather than the steady progress through many pages.
The wax tablet on the reading table beside the lamp collected the day's thoughts as they accumulated. Ancient scholars made extensive use of these small reusable tablets, a wooden frame filled with wax, on which you could write with a stylus, and then smooth out with the flat reverse end of the same tool to erase and begin again. They were the scratch paper of the ancient world, the place where preliminary thoughts and tentative formulations were captured before being developed, if they proved worth developing, into the more permanent form of a papyrus note or a new section of ongoing writing. By the end of an afternoon's reading, a scholar's wax tablet would be dense with observations, half-formed arguments, questions to pursue, references to track down, the productive disorder of a working mind's daily output. But as the evening comes on, most scholars are choosing to conclude rather than extend their work. The major scrolls are rolled up carefully and replaced in their cases. This is not something done carelessly. A rolled scroll carelessly handled can be creased or cracked, and the papyrus, while durable in dry conditions, does not tolerate rough treatment. The end of the day's work includes a brief but careful ritual of putting away, scrolls replaced, wax tablets smoothed, reed pens cleaned, inkwells stoppered. This is not merely housekeeping. It is a kind of gratitude, a small act of respect for the materials that have made the day's work possible.
The evening meal in the oikos is livelier than the midday one. The day's work has been done. The particular concerns of the morning have either been resolved or set aside to be resumed tomorrow, and the mood among the scholars is generally one of ease. They eat more slowly in the evening, drink their watered wine with less urgency, linger over the shared bread and cheese and whatever cooked dish the kitchen has produced. The conversations here have a reflective quality. The thoughts that arose during the day's work but were not quite relevant to the immediate task, the observations that accumulated while reading and have nowhere to go until the reading stops, the half-formed ideas that need the sounding board of a colleague's reaction before they can develop further. After the evening meal, some scholars return to their rooms to write by lamplight, to capture in permanent form the thoughts and observations of the day, before sleep wipes the exact edges from them. The wax tablet that has been in a pocket or satchel all day, covered with small, quick notes, is now transcribed more carefully onto papyrus, the shorthand expanded into full sentences, the sequence of the day's intellectual progress laid out in a form that can be reviewed and built upon tomorrow. This evening writing is, for many scholars, the most productive part of the day, the synthesis that happens when a day's immersion in a problem is given the chance to settle and clarify and offer up its conclusions in the particular lucidity of late evening tiredness.
The sounds of the city outside the Mouseion walls shift as night comes on. The harbour noises diminish as the day's shipping activity concludes. The street sounds change from the complex layered noise of a busy working city to the quieter, more random sounds of evening. A vendor calling out a last sale, dogs, the occasional voices of people walking home by lamplight. From somewhere in the city's music-loving culture, there might be the sound of an aulos, the double reed instrument, something between an oboe and a clarinet, that was the primary melodic instrument of Greek musical life, drifting over the walls and through the garden. The Mouseion complex quiets gradually. Scholars retire to their residential rooms, their small, tidy spaces that by evening hold the particular intimacy of a private life, the personal belongings, the letters from home if home was far away, the ongoing private reading that was different in character from the professional work of the day, chosen for pleasure or rest or simple companionship. Some scholars were known to read poetry for relaxation, not analyzing it, not producing a critical edition of it, just reading it the way anyone reads a beloved text, for the pleasure of the language and the feeling that certain perfect arrangements of words can produce in the mind and body.
The lamps burn lower as the night deepens, and one by one the lit windows of the residential wing go dark. In the library rooms themselves, the lamps have been extinguished, and the scrolls rest in their cases in the complete darkness that a sealed stone room at night produces, the kind of absolute quality darkness that cities today no longer have, in which nothing is visible and everything is still, and the silence is not the absence of sound so much as the presence of quiet, a positive and restful quality all its own. The scrolls in their darkness hold, coiled in their papyrus, the thoughts of centuries. They wait for morning. They wait for the next pair of eyes, the next careful hands, the next mind ready to receive what they contain. Outside, above the city, the stars of the Egyptian sky are brilliant in a way they can be only in a world without artificial light pollution. The Milky Way, a genuine river of light across the zenith, the constellations that Alexandrian astronomers were charting and naming, visible in their full glory, the planet Venus setting in the west, the rising of Sirius or Canopus, depending on the season, carrying, for the Egyptians who had watched these stars for thousands of years before Alexandria existed, their own ancient weight of meaning. The city sleeps, the scholars dream, the library breathes quietly in the dark, and tomorrow, at first light, it will all begin again. Section 14. The legacy carried in silence.
It is a particular quality of the most important things that they are often invisible while they are happening. The scholars who worked in the Library of Alexandria did not, for the most part, believe they were living through a golden age. They simply went to work each morning, they opened their scrolls, they thought their thoughts, they argued with their colleagues and ate their meals and walked in their gardens and went to sleep. They were, as all human beings are, mostly immersed in the present moment of their lives, the daily texture of it, the small concerns and small pleasures that constitute what it actually feels like to be alive in any particular place and time. What they did not know, could not know, was the scale of what they were leaving behind. The calculations of Eratosthenes would survive in references and quotations. The basic insight that the earth was spherical and of measurable size, embedded so thoroughly in the Greek astronomical tradition that it would never quite be lost, even in the long centuries when European culture contracted and the direct connection to Alexandrian scholarship was broken.
The geometry of Euclid would pass from Greek into Arabic into Latin, copied and recopied through the medieval Islamic world and the European universities, teaching mathematics to students for 2,000 years with a clarity and rigor that has never been surpassed. The critical editions of Homer produced by Zenodotus and his successors would form the basis of the Homeric text that every subsequent reader of the Iliad and the Odyssey was reading, so that the words you encounter when you open Homer today have passed through the hands of Alexandrian philologists on their way to you.
The library itself, the physical building, the scrolls, the institution, did not survive. This is one of the great sorrows of intellectual history, and it is complicated by the fact that we cannot even give the loss a clean narrative. There was no single great burning. Julius Caesar's military operations in 48 before the Common Era resulted in a fire that destroyed some scrolls stored in a warehouse near the harbour, perhaps 40,000 of them, a significant loss, but not the total destruction that legend sometimes asserts. The Mouseion continued to function for several more centuries, visited by Strabo around 20 before the Common Era, still active, still housing scholars. The library faded not in one catastrophic moment, but through the slow withdrawal of patronage as the political circumstances changed. Rome, which absorbed Egypt in 30 before the Common Era, had little interest in continuing the extraordinary Ptolemaic investment in pure scholarship. Without money, scholars drifted away. Without scholars, the institution lost its living purpose. Without maintenance and use, the collection deteriorated. Later fires and conflicts took further tolls over the subsequent centuries. The daughter library in the Serapeum was reportedly destroyed in 391 of the Common Era, when a Christian mob, in the context of the violent religious politics of the late Roman Empire, attacked and demolished the temple complex. Whatever survived of the main collection seems to have faded entirely during the Arab conquest of Alexandria in 641 of the Common Era. The library's end, like its beginning, was not the work of a single moment, but of a long and complicated history.
But the loss, real and painful as it is, should not be the last word, because what the Library of Alexandria produced did not entirely disappear with it. The ideas that were generated there, the methods that were developed there, the traditions of textual scholarship and systematic inquiry and multilingual, cross-cultural intellectual exchange that it institutionalized, these things survived in fragments and references and influences embedded in the tradition that followed, shaping the shape of every subsequent attempt human beings have made to gather knowledge systematically and make it available to those who could use it. Every university library that exists today is, at some remove of influence and imitation and historical derivation, a descendant of the Library of Alexandria. The idea that knowledge should be gathered in one place and made available to qualified seekers, that scholars should be freed from material worry to concentrate on their work, that texts should be carefully preserved and accurately copied and systematically organized. These ideas did not originate entirely in Alexandria, but they were given their clearest and most influential early form there. The catalogue of Callimachus, long lost, is the ancestor of every library catalogue ever made, every bibliographic database, every search engine that indexes the world's knowledge and returns it on demand. The philological methods of Zenodotus and Aristarchus are the ancestors of every edition, every critical text, every scholarly annotation. The mathematical rigor of Euclid is the ancestor of every logical system, every formal proof, every computer program that operates on defined rules applied consistently to stated conditions. Eratosthenes' method: use careful observation, apply mathematical reasoning, produce a quantitative result, is the ancestor of the entire scientific method.
These things are not small. They are the infrastructure of the world we live in, built so long ago and so thoroughly incorporated into everything that has followed, that they are now invisible, the way the foundation of a house is invisible once the house is built, but without which the house could not stand. There is a smaller, quieter kind of legacy that is harder to measure, but no less real. Every reader who has ever felt at home in a library, who has experienced the particular comfort of being surrounded by books, the sense of being in a space organized around the respectful and serious treatment of ideas, the feeling that in this place, at least, thinking is valued, is experiencing something that the Library of Alexandria helped to establish. The shape of what a library feels like, the culture of quiet and careful attention that libraries institutionalize, the understanding that some spaces are set aside specifically for the encounter between a human mind and accumulated human thought. These things were not inevitable. They had to be invented, and they were invented in their most influential and durable early form, in Alexandria. The library gave the ancient world a model of what systematic scholarship could look like when it was properly resourced and properly organized. It showed that the accumulation of knowledge was not just a side effect of individual genius, but something that could be deliberately cultivated through institutional design, through the creation of spaces, the provision of materials, the gathering of people, and the removal of material anxiety. It demonstrated for anyone willing to observe its results that investing in pure intellectual inquiry, in thinking done for its own sake, without immediate practical application, produced over time practical results of extraordinary value. The measurement of the Earth's circumference had navigational implications. Euclid's geometry had architectural and engineering implications. The medical advances of Herophilus and Erasistratus had obvious clinical implications. But none of these things were produced in service of those applications. They were produced in service of understanding itself, and the applications followed as a consequence. And beyond all the grand intellectual legacy, there is this. The Library of Alexandria was a place where people went to work every morning at something they believed mattered, where the act of thinking carefully, of reading attentively, of asking the next question and then the next question after that, was considered not merely acceptable but admirable, not merely permitted but honored, where the resources of a wealthy and powerful state were deliberately committed to the proposition that understanding the world was worth spending money on, worth building buildings for, worth feeding and housing and freeing from worry an entire community of minds devoted to nothing else. That proposition, that thinking is worth supporting, that knowledge has value beyond its immediate practical application, that the patient and unhurried work of understanding is one of the most important things a human being can do, is not one that every age has accepted. It is not one that our own age has fully accepted. But it was the animating conviction of the Library of Alexandria, held by the Ptolemaic rulers who funded it, and the scholars who lived in it, and the scribes who copied its scrolls, and the gardeners who tended its botanical collections, and the cooks who fed its scholars their daily bread. In the evenings, when the library rooms went dark, and the scholars returned to their quiet private lives, and the Mediterranean stars came out over Alexandria in all their unhurried ancient brightness, there was a kind of peace in that place that is not easy to name, but is easy to recognize. It was the peace of purposeful work completed, the peace of a day spent doing exactly what you were supposed to be doing,
in exactly the place you were supposed to be doing it, in the company of others who understood and shared the purpose. It was the peace of a library at closing time, which is one of the quietest and most beautiful peacefulnesses the human world has ever produced.
And in the darkness of the locked and lamplit free reading rooms, the scrolls rested in their pinaces cases, thousands upon thousands of them, containing between their coiled papyrus layers the thoughts of centuries, the questions and answers of 100 civilizations, the careful observations and reckless speculations and patient arguments of all the human minds that had ever put reed to papyrus and tried to say something true about the world they found themselves in. They rested quietly. They waited for morning. They waited for the next set of eyes, the next pair of careful hands, the next mind ready to take what they held and carry it forward, one reading at a time, into a future the original authors could not have imagined, but somehow, in the act of writing, were already addressing. Morning would come, as it always does, from the east. The light would move across the garden first, then catch the columns of the peripaitos, then spread slowly across the stone floor of the library's entrance hall. The scholars would rise. The garden would fill with birdsong. The smell of bread from the kitchen would drift through the cool early air. And somewhere in the stacks, in the beautiful organized darkness of the scroll cases, a text that had been waiting there for decades or centuries would be found again, unrolled with care, read by a new pair of eyes that would understand it differently than any previous reader had, finding in it something the original author perhaps had not intended, certainly had not predicted, but had made possible by the simple act of writing it down and the further act of keeping it safe.
This is what the Library of Alexandria was. Not a monument to glory or a symbol of empire or a tourist attraction for the ancient world. It was a place where people kept things safe, where the most vulnerable and most durable of all human productions, ideas put into words, written on fragile material, endlessly in danger of being lost, endlessly capable of being found again, were gathered and preserved and organized and made accessible to anyone with the curiosity and the training to use them. It was, in the most literal sense, the world's memory. And for the century and a half of its great flourishing, it remembered more carefully and more completely than anything before or since. If you carry anything away from this long, slow journey through its corridors tonight, carry this. Somewhere in the deep quiet of a night 2,000 years ago, a scholar in Alexandria extinguished his lamp and put his scroll away and went to sleep, having done exactly what he was meant to do. He had read something, understood something, perhaps written something that would outlast him. He did not know what would become of it. He did not need to. He had done the work. The rest was up to time.
Let that be enough as you settle in and let the sounds of your own world grow distant. Let the image of that scholar's extinguished lamp, that quiet library, that garden full of Mediterranean stars, carry you gently towards sleep. The thoughts are still there somewhere. The scrolls have been replaced by other forms, more durable in some ways, more fragile in others. But the impulse that created the Library of Alexandria, the deep human need to gather what is known, to hold it carefully, to pass it on. That impulse is alive in every library that still exists, every book that remains in print, every piece of knowledge that someone has taken the trouble to preserve and share. It is alive in you who sought out a story tonight to carry you to sleep. It is alive in the human habit of listening, of wanting to know what happened, of finding the particular comfort of the past, a reliable company in the quiet hours. Sleep well. The library is still open. The scrolls are still waiting. And there is always more to read.
The ancient city of Alexandria is gone in the form it once held. Its colonnades are beneath the sea or beneath the modern streets. Its harbour has silted up and been rebuilt and silted again. The great lighthouse fell in a series of earthquakes across the medieval centuries, and its stones were used to build a fortress which still stands on Pharaoh's Island in a different form. But the place where the Mouseion stood, somewhere in what is now a dense and lively Egyptian city, full of coffee shops and tram lines and apartment buildings stacked against the Mediterranean horizon, still holds whatever it is that places hold when they have been the scene of something remarkable. The ground remembers, even when the buildings are gone. The air still comes in off the same sea, still carries the same salt. And in the early mornings, when the light is golden and low and the city is still quiet, something in the quality of that light over the water is, if you are willing to imagine it, exactly what it was when a scholar 2,000 years ago rose before the rest of his household, pulled on his sandals, and walked out into a garden full of birds and the soft smell of growing things, to begin another day of thinking.
If tonight's journey to Alexandria brought you some peace, we would be truly grateful for your support. We are working toward 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and each one of you brings us closer. Please like this video if it helped you drift. Leave a comment telling us where in the world you are right now and what the time is on your clock. And subscribe if you would like more journeys like this one. The ancient world is large and quiet and full of stories worth telling slowly. We will be here, telling them. Good night.